In this episode, we turn to 2 Corinthians, not as a book of doctrine, but as a voice under pressure, a letter shaped by conflict, defense, and identity. What do we find when we listen closely? Not just theology, but a struggle for trust, authority, and meaning.
2 Corinthians is often read as a theological letter, but when we look closely, that expectation quickly breaks down. What we find is not a structured argument about God, salvation, or law. Instead, we encounter something much more personal, much more fluid, and in many ways much more strategic. This is not a systematic text. It is not a careful exposition of doctrine. It is a response, a reaction, a defense. At the center of the letter is not a theological idea, but a person, Paul. And he is under pressure. His authority is being questioned. His relationship with the Corinthian community has been strained. There are other voices present, other leaders, other influences, and Paul is forced to respond. This context is essential because it changes how we read everything in the letter. If we approach 2 Corinthians as theology, we will miss its primary function. But if we read it as a document shaped by conflict, then its structure, tone, and language begin to make sense. Throughout the letter, Paul explains himself. He justifies his actions. He appeals to the Corinthians to trust him again. This is not the voice of someone teaching from a secure position. It is the voice of someone who must re-establish credibility. One of the most striking features of the letter is its emphasis on weakness. Paul repeatedly highlights his own suffering. He speaks of hardship, persecution, and vulnerability. He presents himself as afflicted, pressured, and fragile. But he does not present these as failures. He turns them into arguments. This is where the rhetoric becomes clear. In the ancient world, authority was typically associated with strength. A legitimate leader was expected to be impressive, articulate, and successful. Paul does not fit that model, at least not in the eyes of his critics. So instead of competing on those terms, he redefines the criteria. Weakness becomes strength. Suffering becomes proof. Vulnerability becomes authenticity. This is not merely a spiritual idea. It is also a rhetorical strategy. Paul takes what could be seen as disqualifying traits and reframes them as the very evidence of his legitimacy. It is a powerful move, but it is also a necessary one if his authority is being challenged. The presence of opponents in Corinth is one of the key background elements of the letter. Paul refers to them indirectly. He speaks of those who present themselves as superior, more impressive, more authoritative. At one point, he refers to them almost sarcastically as super-apostles. But we never hear their side. Everything we know about them comes through Paul's descriptions. This means that we are not observing a neutral theological debate. We are witnessing a conflict, but only from one perspective. That alone should make us cautious. Because what appears as a contrast between truth and error may also be a competition between different leaders, different interpretations, and different ways of presenting authority. Paul's response to these rivals is not only argumentative, it is also performative. He constructs an identity in contrast to them. They boast in strength, he boasts in weakness. They present themselves as impressive, he presents himself as suffering. They claim authority through status, he claims it through endurance. But this is not a rejection of authority, it is a redefinition of it. Paul does not step away from leadership. He does not say that authority does not matter. On the contrary, he insists on being recognized. He expects to be heard. He defends his position repeatedly. The difference lies in how he justifies that position. Instead of pointing to success, he points to hardship. Instead of pointing to eloquence, he points to perseverance. This shift is central to understanding the letter. It allows Paul to maintain authority while simultaneously appearing humble. But it also creates a tension. Because the more he emphasizes his humility, the more he must also assert himself in order to be taken seriously. This tension becomes especially visible in the later chapters of the letter. The tone changes. It becomes sharper, more confrontational, even ironic. Paul begins to engage in what he himself calls boasting. He lists his experiences, his sufferings, even his visions. There is an element of irony here, as if he is mimicking the style of his opponents. But at the same time, he is doing exactly what he claims to reject. He is presenting credentials. He is asserting his uniqueness. He is drawing attention to himself. This creates a complex picture. Paul is not simply humble. nor is he simply self-promoting. He is both, depending on the moment. And that complexity reflects the situation he is in. He is navigating a conflict where he must appear both authentic and authoritative at the same time. Another important section of the letter deals with the collection of money. At first glance, this seems like a practical matter. Paul encourages the Corinthians to contribute to a collection for others. He speaks about generosity and willingness. But even here, the rhetorical dimension is present. Paul uses comparison. He refers to other communities and their commitment. He creates a sense of expectation. The giving is described as voluntary, but the social pressure is not absent. This again raises a question about influence. Where is the line between encouragement and persuasion, between spiritual leadership and subtle pressure? The text does not resolve this tension. It simply operates within it. One of the most notable features of 2 Corinthians is its language. The letter is filled with striking images. Treasure in jars of clay, afflicted in every way but not crushed. These are not technical formulations. They are poetic expressions. They create an emotional connection. They shape how the reader perceives Paul. They reinforce the identity he is constructing. This is important because it shows that the letter is not only communicating ideas. It is shaping perception. It is guiding the reader toward a particular conclusion about who Paul is and why he should be trusted. In that sense, the poetic language is not separate from the argument. It is part of the argument. When we step back and look at the letter as a whole, a different picture emerges from what we might expect. This is not primarily a document about theology. It is a document about authority, identity, and relationship. It reveals a community that is not stable, not unified, but in the midst of negotiation and tension. It reveals a leader who is not simply teaching, but responding, adapting, and defending. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals that early movements like this were not monolithic. They contained diversity, disagreement, and conflict. Different voices competed for influence. Different interpretations coexisted and clashed. Paul is one of those voices, a significant one, certainly, but still one among others. This does not necessarily diminish his importance, but it does place him within a human context, a context of communication, persuasion, and struggle. If we read 2 Corinthians with that in mind, the letter becomes more than a source of doctrine. It becomes a window into a real situation, a moment where authority is not assumed but contested, where identity is not given but constructed. And that may be the most valuable insight it offers, not a system of belief, but a glimpse into how belief, authority, and community were negotiated in practice.
2 Corinthians leaves us with more than answers. It reveals tension, vulnerability, and the complexity of leadership. Perhaps the deeper insight is not only what Paul believed, but how he navigated conflict and influence. See you next time.